Right now, as you listen to this, there are entire towns sitting at the bottom of California's reservoirs. Not ruins, not rubble. Towns, streets, front porches, kitchens where people made breakfast on an ordinary morning and never came back. Churches where families buried their grandparents. Schools where children sat in rows and learned to read. All of it underwater. And here is the part that should stop you cold. In dry years, when the water drops low enough, they come back up. Walls break the surface. Road signs appear from the dark water. People drive out to the shore and stand there, staring at the rooftops of a world the state decided to drown. Nobody warned most of these families with enough time. Nobody asked the communities that had been there for generations. A decision was made, somewhere far away, in an office, on paper, and the water rose. My name is Thomas. This is Lost US Towns. And today, we are going under. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe and like it. It really helps the channel grow. Here is something the tour boats do not tell you. When Lake Berryessa is low enough, you can see the outline of streets beneath the surface. Not just foundations, streets. Monticello was founded in 1848. It sat in a wide, green valley in Napa County, surrounded by oak hills and farmland. By the time the federal government started drawing plans for Monticello Dam, the town had been there over 100 years. There was a church, a school, a hotel, a post office that had been running since before the Civil War. Families had buried 3 and 4 generations in the local cemetery. The Bureau of Reclamation sent notices in the early 1950s. The valley would be flooded to create a water supply for the growing cities of the Bay Area. Residents were told to move. Most did. A few did not go quietly. One elderly farmer reportedly told the government agent that he had been born in that house and he intended to die in it. He did not mean it the way it sounded, but he did not leave easily either. The cemetery was relocated, most of it. There are accounts suggesting that not every grave was moved, that some markers were missed, that the ground under the water holds more than concrete and lumber. The dam was completed in 1957. The water rose through 1958. Monticello went under for the last time. In dry summers, the famous Glory Hole spillway at Berryessa draws photographers from across the state. They come to watch water pour into the giant drain. Almost none of them know they are standing above a town. The streets are still there. The water just covers them. The last resident of St. Thomas did not drive away. He paddled away. That detail has stayed with people for 80 years, and it is not hard to understand why. St. Thomas was founded in 1865 by settlers who built farms along the Virgin River where it meets the Nevada-California border. Over the following decades, it grew slowly, the way desert towns do, with difficulty and stubbornness. A post office, a few stores, families who had nowhere else to be and made something out of that fact. When Hoover Dam was completed in 1935, the reservoir behind it, Lake Mead, began filling. The engineers knew St. Thomas was in the flood zone. The residents knew too. They watched the water rise for 3 years. Some left early, some stayed as long as they could, moving furniture to higher ground, floor by floor, as the water crept up the walls. The last man left in 1938. He'd lived in St. Thomas his entire life. He climbed into a small boat and pushed off from the porch of a house he owned and would never see again. He looked back. The account of what he said, if he said anything, was not recorded. The water closed over St. Thomas shortly after. In 2002, a severe drought dropped Lake Mead to historic lows. St. Thomas came back. Walls emerged from the water, foundation lines appeared. A glass bottle from the 1930s was found sitting upright on a shelf of sediment exactly where someone had left it. Archaeologists moved through the ruins carefully. Then the water came back and St. Thomas went under again. It has surfaced and submerged 3 times since. It is down there right now. Nobody moved the altars. That is the thing that stays with you when you start reading about what went under Lake Don Pedro in 1971. The Tuolumne River Canyon had been home to gold rush settlements since 1849. Chinese laborers came by the thousands in the early years of the rush, building camps along the river bends where the gold-bearing gravel collected. They built more than camps. They built communities, wooden temples, small altars to ancestors, shared kitchens, gardens that had no business growing in that soil but grew anyway because people needed something familiar. The violence against those communities is its own story and a brutal one. But the people who survived stayed, or their children stayed, and by the 20th century the River Canyon held the layered remnants of that entire era. Wood structures, stone walls, the physical record of lives that history had mostly chosen not to document. New Don Pedro Dam was completed in 1971. The reservoir filled over the following months. Nobody conducted a serious archaeological survey first. Nobody cataloged what was in the canyon before the water rose. The altars, the temple foundations, the remnants of those camps, all of it went under without inventory. Divers have explored the canyon floor in the decades since. They describe a silence down there that feels different from ordinary water silence. Objects sitting undisturbed on the bottom. A stillness that has not been touched in over 50 years. The gold rush built California. California drowned the record of it. Lake Tulloch sits just downstream from Don Pedro, and it keeps a quieter secret. The land under Tulloch was copper country during the Civil War era. Small mining settlements grew up along the creek beds in the 1860s, supplying raw copper to Union foundries that turned it into artillery casings and rifle fittings. The men who worked those mines never got famous. They did not strike gold. They pulled copper out of the ground for wages that barely covered their board, lived in canvas and rough lumber camps, and died in numbers that the local records tracked only loosely. When Tulloch Dam was completed in 1958, the reservoir filled over farmland and the remnants of those mining settlements both. Unlike the gold rush camps upstream, these sites had almost no documentation, no photographs, very few names. The settlements were already half forgotten by the time the water came. Local residents who grew up along the old creek banks before the dam say the same thing. In the driest summers, when the lake drops and the wind moves a certain way, there is a smell that comes off the water. Not decay, older than that. Something from the wood and the earth underneath, coming up through the water after 60 years. Nobody has gone down to verify what remains. The sites are not on any preservation list. They are not on any list at all. The copper helped win a war. The men who dug it are at the bottom of a recreational lake, and the people skiing over them have no idea they are there. Before we go any further, picture Yosemite, the granite walls, the waterfalls, the floor of the valley wide and green and so quiet it makes you stop breathing for a second. Now imagine draining it. That is exactly what happened to Hetch Hetchy. The Hetch Hetchy Valley sat inside what is now Yosemite National Park. Indigenous peoples had lived in that valley for thousands of years before the first settlers arrived. By the early 1900s, small farms and grazing operations had taken root on the valley floor. The Tuolumne River ran clean and cold through the middle of it. Naturalists who had seen both valleys said openly that Hetch Hetchy was the equal of Yosemite in every way that mattered. San Francisco wanted the water. After the earthquake and fire of 1906 destroyed much of the city, the argument for a reliable mountain water supply became impossible to defeat politically. Congress voted in 1913 to dam the valley. One of the most respected voices in American conservation at the time called it a desecration of something that belonged to every person in the country, not just the engineers and city planners who wanted to flood it. He spent the remaining year of his life fighting the decision. He lost. The dam was completed in 1923. The valley filled. The farms, the meadows, the river bends, and every trace of the people who had lived there for generations went under the surface of a reservoir that now supplies drinking water to 2.5 million people. The water is still there, the valley is still there underneath it, and the argument about whether it was worth it has never actually ended. The notices arrived while the men were overseas. That fact alone tells you everything you need to know about how this was handled. Shasta Dam is the largest dam in California. Lake Shasta, the reservoir it created, holds more water than any other body of water in the state. To fill it, the Bureau of Reclamation needed to clear an enormous stretch of the upper Sacramento Valley. That meant farms, orchards, small towns. The community of Old Shasta, which had been a supply hub since the gold rush era, along with dozens of homesteads that families had worked for 2 and 3 generations. Construction began in 1938. The relocation orders came during the early years of World War II. In many households, the father and the older sons were already gone, drafted, or enlisted. The women left behind received the paperwork, packed what they could carry, watched government bulldozers knock down structures their families had built with their own hands, and moved to wherever they could find room. Some families received compensation. The amounts were calculated by the government and were not subject to negotiation. You took what they offered, or you left with nothing at all. Several families chose nothing. They walked away from land their grandparents had homesteaded rather than accept a price they considered an insult. The dam was completed in 1945. The reservoir filled over the following years. The orchards, the farmhouses, the root cellars packed with preserved food that nobody had time to empty, all of it went under. In drought years, the old valley floor appears at the edges of the reservoir, cracked and pale. The outlines of fields are still visible from the air. The land remembers the shape it used to be. In 1849, a man staked a claim on a gravel bar along the Feather River and called his camp Humbug City because he was certain the gold there was a fraud. He was wrong. The gold was real. Within months, thousands of people were living in canvas and rough timber along that river stretch, digging, panning, fighting, dying in numbers that nobody tracked carefully enough to remember. Humbug City and the settlements around it became part of the landscape of the Feather River Canyon for over 100 years. The gold rush camps thinned out. Small farms took their place. Families who had come for gold and stayed for land put down roots in the canyon soil. Oroville Dam was completed in 1968. It was, at the time, the tallest earthen dam in the world. The reservoir behind it swallowed the lower Feather River Canyon completely. The old campsites, the farm remnants, the layered physical record of 120 years of human settlement, all of it went under 30 meters of water. In February of 2017, a crisis at the Oroville Dam spillway forced the evacuation of nearly 200,000 people downstream. For several days, the water level in the reservoir dropped dramatically as engineers worked to manage the damage. Old shorelines appeared. The edges of the drowned canyon emerged from the water for the first time in decades. People who lived nearby drove out and stood at the waterline, looking at a landscape their grandparents had described to them. Then the crisis passed. The water came back up. Humbug City went under again. It is still down there. Here is something the water authorities do not put in their press releases. When a reservoir drops low enough to expose a submerged town, the damage happens fast. Wood that has been preserved underwater for 60 years begins to deteriorate within days of hitting open air. Stone foundations crack in the sun. Objects that survived decades on the bottom disintegrate in weeks on the shore. Archaeologists call it the emergence problem. The thing that was preserved by the water is destroyed by the very drought that revealed it. Since 2012, California has experienced the most severe drought cycles in recorded history. Lake Oroville, Lake Shasta, Lake Berryessa, Lake Mead, all of them have dropped to historic lows multiple times. Each time, something surfaces. A rooftop, a road sign, a set of concrete steps leading down to a front door that is no longer there. Families whose grandparents were displaced drive out to stand at the waterline. Some of them are seeing for the first time the places described to them in stories told at kitchen tables for 50 years. A woman who visited the exposed shoreline of one reservoir during the 2021 drought said she found the stone gatepost of her grandmother's farm still standing in the dry lake bed. The gate was gone, the post was there. She stood next to it for a long time. There is no state plan for what to do with these sites when they surface, no preservation budget, no archaeological response team on standby. The sites appear, they begin to fall apart, and the next rainfall covers them again. The record disappears a little more each time. One day the droughts will expose foundations that have finally crossed the line from ruin into nothing, and nobody will have written down what was there. Every town on this list has the same shape when you strip it down. Somebody needed the water. Somebody already lived where the water was going to go. The first group had lawyers and government contracts. The second group had roots and graves and kitchens and the particular kind of belonging that does not transfer to a relocation check. The water won every time. What makes California's submerged towns different from the Appalachian ghost towns left behind by coal companies is not the scale of the loss. The scale is comparable. What makes them different is the permanence. A coal town left empty on a hillside can at least be visited. The structure is there, the streets are walkable, you can stand in the doorway and understand what it used to be. The towns under California's reservoirs can only be imagined. You stand on the surface of the water and try to picture what is 30 feet below you. A school, a general store, a cemetery where somebody's great-grandmother is buried and where her family has never been able to return. When the drought years come and the water drops, those places surface for a little while. Not long enough. Never long enough. And then the rains return, the reservoir fills, and California drinks the water that is sitting on top of everything it chose to forget. The towns are still down there, every single one of them. My name is Thomas. This is Lost U.S. Towns. Subscribe, because there is always more underneath the surface.